Yeah, thank you very much. I'm giving the talk in, for many co-authors. You see 8 names there, and this was really a very collaborative effort, as you will see. It's part of the Mature project, which has recently ended, so you are now witnessing one of the final presentations. So what has actually come out, and this is a presentation about the empirical work that has gone on in the Mature project. Of course, we have developed a lot of software as well, but a very important part of this was to have also empirical work guiding this technical development. So I will talk about I will talk about a study today, a multiple case study we conducted in the last project year, and I'm going to talk about the overall context and the methodology we employed, the goals we had for this study, namely to find organizational and technological arrangements of successful organizations. I'm going to talk about the procedure, of course, about the results, and of course conclusions and discuss. And some of you may be familiar with the Mature project, or maybe with the knowledge maturing model. I will, because it provided the basis of this research, I'm going to give you a quick intro here, but for more details, obviously you have to read the paper. So we see knowledge maturing that is happening in organizational settings as goal-oriented learning on a collective level. So it is on the one hand goal-oriented, so the organization wants to achieve some goals, but on the other hand it is also a collective phenomenon. Maybe to make it a little bit more specific, we see it as a social process, as a tool-mediated process, and a process that takes place in the interaction between individuals that are working in organizations, between communities that you find there, and the organization as a whole. So there's one of the important model elements of the knowledge maturing model. So we see, we understand knowledge maturing as, this model has was generated by a lot of practical evidence, but also a lot of research that has gone into it, and we find in many cases that organizational learning, organizational development takes place in a certain sequence of steps. So you usually start out here with certain people, individuals mostly, expressing ideas that they have about something, for example, a new product that's new product ideas, new technologies that they want to invest in. Some of these ideas are appropriated, so they are taken up further, then they are shared, and we are entering the community setting, in a setting where they are shared with others that have similar interests, where the idea is, of course, more refined, also documented, so it can be shared. It enters the next stage where the idea might be formalized, so that it can be, for example, presented to some senior management in a more appropriate way, and you might end up in the end with kind of a standardized product, for example. So this is what we very often observe, how knowledge is developed in companies, and this is a very complex process, of course. And it should be said that, of course, not all the ideas make it all the way through, but in each of those stages, of course, some things are forgotten, are not used, are not pursued any further. That's just how it happens. And of course, it should also not be seen as a one-way process, but there's of course a lot of going back and forth here in this process. And you see that we're assuming 2 processes are in place. So maturing is the one that kind of pushes ideas further because of many enthusiastic individuals who want to pursue some ideas, who have the motivation to pursue things further. But on the other hand, you also have guidance from the organizational level. So it means the organization picks out certain ideas that fit very well into, for example, the strategy and so on. So what happens in this process are a whole lot of activities. Many of those are tool mediated, and we'll have some examples later on. So typical activities you find in all kinds of other knowledge management frameworks as well. And so what was now the question, why are some organizations actually much more successful than others? Or why do some organizations actually perceive themselves more successful than others? And that was the guiding question of this research. So the study that we conducted was a multiple case study, but it was actually conducted in a series of other studies that have been going on before. So we started out with an ethnographic study, then 1 year later did a large-scale representative study, and the in-depth study that I'm going to report about today was the third study in this sequence. And for the first one, we tried to get an in-depth understanding within 7 organizations. What is knowledge maturing actually? How does it happen? What activities are there? What tools are used? So we get a very in-depth understanding of the processes, activities that are going on. In the second stage, we had this large representative study where we tried to validate some of the findings from the ethnographic study. And now we looked at 7 organizations in more depth that were perceived by us or who perceived themselves as being particularly successful in several of those dimensions. So what we did was look at these 7 cases in depth. We performed 56 in-depth contextual interviews. With that I mean they were actually conducted at the workplace, so not over the telephone, but in the actual workplace setting, which I think in this case is very important. And the focus here was on collectives of people, so it was not one department, but we tried to identify these knowledge maturing activities that usually span boundaries of organizations. So we tried to identify people that could talk about the whole process. And that's the paper I'm talking about today. So in the first phase, we knew what to look for. In the second, we tried to identify these successful cases that I'm talking about today. And then we got an in-depth understanding of success, what they perceive to be successful arrangements. The goals of the study were to find out what are the reasons that they perceive themselves to be better than others, what organizational measures they employed, what IT-oriented measures they employed that they thought supported knowledge maturing, what barriers they perceived, and what plans they had for the future. And here's the study design derived from a methodology, multiple case study design. So you start out with developing a theory, and that's what we had done with the knowledge maturing model. We selected the cases. I told you how the cases were selected. These 7 cases that we thought were particularly successful. We designed a data collection protocol, so we thought about who to interview, how to interview them, what questions to ask. And then you conduct basically independently, but guided by this common protocol, individual case studies, in our case 7. You do the interviews, you write individual case reports, and then you get together and you try to draw conclusions across the cases. So that should, on the one hand, allow you still to have a very deep understanding of individual cases, but also generalize across the cases by looking at conclusions that you can draw across them. So here are the cases. There were 7. So you see that, some large enterprises, but also smaller ones, actually also a network, some service, some industry, and the participants here are the participants that were somehow involved in those interviews. Several countries were involved. But here, as I said before, we weren't looking so much for representativeness, but rather for identifying successful cases. Here, I'm not going to read all this, But here you can see, get a feeling a little bit more what kind of questions we then actually asked. So for example, why do you think this unit or this organization performs knowledge maturing better than others? I should say maybe before that of course, as an introductory to this whole process, the knowledge maturing model was explained to them and was kind of checked that they had an understanding of this, and we also tried to get an understanding of the process that was going on in terms of the knowledge maturing model. I'll show an example later on. So what community, organizational, IT-based measures are employed, maybe informally, maybe formally. So these were just the questions that were asked so that triggering people to talk about certain measures that they found important. We were also collecting barriers, specific IT tools, what tools are they using, how are they using them. I should say that these two parts will not be a focus of this talk. I'm just more concentrating on the first two questions and the plans that they had. So I'm going to show just one case as an example. You find the other cases in the paper. I'm going to choose the case study we conducted in Graz, because that was the one I was involved in, so I can talk about it maybe a little bit more in depth. So it's a small software company in Austria, but it has offices also in support units in Germany and the Netherlands, so they were used to working quite distributed and of course, small and developing software. So here was our attempt in these first initial interviews to find a mapping between what they were doing, what they were perceiving themselves to be doing as being particularly successful, and the knowledge maturing model. And you see that we identified in this case two knowledge maturing processes. So one is software development, of course. They produce some software that the clients in the end hopefully pay some money for. But another process that was actually quite important we call support, documentation, and training. So it turns out that they not only produce some tools, but they also have to teach all kinds of people how to use them. Yeah? So the clients, they have to teach the clients, but they also have to teach their own developers, how to develop them, and so on. So there was basically this learning process at the same time. And here you see some activities that are going on. So for example, generating ideas about new functionalities, for example, or how to solve a problem that is reoccurring. That would be happening here, often by individuals. They were then shared, discussed in developer meetings, prioritized maybe what we should concentrate on, and so on. And maybe at the end of this, they would actually turn into products or as into parts of that product. And similarly here, we have activities as well. So when we're talking about this here, then here in this initial phase, we're talking about a phase where, for example, customer request comes and it is about an area that nobody really knows much about. So it's an immature, basically, knowledge area or problem that the company hasn't really started to investigate in more depth. And then you are in a very individual phase because the individual support people have to find some solution for it, contact developers, and so on. And only maybe if this here turns up more often, then you would enter such a knowledge maturing process here where things might be documented for others to use and so on. So that's just to give you an idea. And only very quickly what were the kinds of measures that they employed. So IT-related measures, they were talking about a wiki that they had initially actually only introduced to make the software documentation a little bit more dynamic, so that you didn't have Word documents where your software documentation was in, and then you had huge difficulties to change it all the time, and you have different versions and all that. So the wiki was actually introduced to make a dynamic software documentation. But they later found that the wiki was useful for them for many other reasons as well. So for example, they could actually edit the wiki right when they were meeting in the software development meetings, and to check off the issues that they wanted to work on, to assign also things that people wanted to work on, to collect some initial ideas, information that people were finding directly in the wiki, so that then in the end it could somehow lead directly into the software documentation. Yeah, some other IT measures and organizational measures that was also important. They had initiated this Scrum process, and one important element that they talked about were these stand-up meetings, where they were meeting once a week, just a short meeting and identifying the issues that they had worked on, seeing how are we doing with these different issues, who should be responsible for doing what, are there problems, and then reassigning the work maybe, things like that. So very interactive, very active get-together, so to say. Just about methodology, so we have then this one case. Actually, we started off with some guiding cases, some initial examples. So the University of Innsbruck performed these two as kind of examples. Then other cases were added to this. Then there was a first reflection once these cases were finished. Then people were going back to their own cases again, reflecting again about their own cases, about the interviews they had done, maybe recoding some of the things, and then there was kind of a final joint reflection about this, and that was when the final result was created. This is how it was done. So you have one topic here, for example, reasons for better performance of knowledge maturing, and we then came up with different reasons that were mentioned. And of course, some reasons were mentioned in several cases, and this was then coded in the interviews and so on. And the same with the other topics. So this is how the cross-case analysis applied. Okay, what are the results? We basically decided at one point that we would code the results in such a very simplified model. So we were looking on the one hand for, and the model would look at levers, effects, and outcomes. Yeah, so very, very simple, very, very simple model. So we're looking at what were the expected and hoped and also experienced effects of certain measures. What were the levers? So the measures they were introducing to reach those effects. And as a guiding principle, and this we didn't then check empirically, but as a guiding principle was always this should then lead to an outcome that they perceive themselves to be better than others. So the lever is a kind of an action, measure, initiative that an organizational unit, a group can perform. An effect is the direct effect of this measure, of this lever in a certain very concrete setting, and the performance, of course, that they thought this was somehow important for performing knowledge maturing better. And here are some of the effects that we found. On the individual, on the community, on the organizational level. So for example, individuals' increased willingness to share knowledge was one of the effects that they perceived to be very important. On the community level, this improved accessibility, for example, was something that came up in many of the cases. And on the organizational level, you see as well. And here are some of the levers that were identified. So, for example, soliciting some new knowledge, acting as a claimant, for example. So it needs somebody in the organization to take a claim into a certain measure to make sure that it's really followed through by everybody. So that was an important concept. But also guidance, as I mentioned before. So the organization introduces some measures of how to guide knowledge maturing in certain directions, what kind of knowledge is important, where should we put our efforts into, and so on. And then we actually looked in the cases for some evidence of where in the cases people thought that some of the levers were actually instrumental to reach certain effects. And then you arrive at this very complicated looking model. So in the middle you have the effects on the individual, community and organization level, and you have levers that contribute to these effects. And each of the arrows here indicates that at least in one case this was seen as being instrumental for performing knowledge maturing better. So for example, in the case of Philipp Rath, the openness to change was a topic that was seen as very important, as a very important outcome, and 3 different things were seen as conducive to this. So these workshops that were conducted on a specific topic, enabling collaborative learning through this wiki, and improving access to documented knowledge. So, what makes our cases successful? The conclusions I would like to take. So, this model with the arrows looks like it's a very very simple cause and effect relationship, but of course that was not at all the case. So we saw in each of the cases that it were more complex and then what we call technological and organizational arrangements around a certain technology, introducing certain new organizational arrangements as well, that were used to make certain things happening. And you find in the literature, for example, the community of practice literature, something that we found a lot of evidence for. So we found that these cases are very good in finding a balance between what is called different community rhythms. So, for example, the rhythm between participation and verification. So a wiki can be used to document things, to reify knowledge, to write things down, to share, but participation at the same time is important. So you need the meetings, you need the discussions around these topics that you put into the wiki to make it really effective. Yeah? So this is quite clear that we see it across all cases that these community rhythms were adhered to. Togetherness versus separation is another one, individual versus group. Grassroots development versus organizational guidance. So the cases achieved a very good balance between, on the one hand, allowing ideas to emerge, grassroots ideas to emerge, and on the other hand, introducing measures that would guide where things should be going to. So for example, introducing certain templates in the wiki that would give more structure to certain wiki entries. Okay, and as a conclusion, we did an in-depth study of 7 different cases as a multiple case study design. We got a very rich picture of knowledge maturing processes and practices, also from multiple perspectives in the organization. So because we try to cover persons from very different areas of the organization. We gained an understanding of the impact that certain organizational IT measures had, and we then called those organizational and technological arrangements with this levers and effect model. We identified 18 levers and 7 effects that were seen as important, and you should check the paper for more detail on this. And what we think, this model, of course, can be used for performing knowledge maturing initiatives more effectively in the future, and also give guidelines on how to introduce certain technologies that people are talking about. So, I'm happy to take your questions.
Thanks a lot.